Death was a constant shadow in the Victorian era. But faced with overflowing graveyards and rampant disease, the Victorians didn't just despair, they transformed grief into art. They looked at the grim, crowded churchyards of their cities and asked a radical question. What if a cemetery wasn't just a place for the dead, but a beautiful healing garden for the living? Hello and welcome to Season 2 of Roots Revealed. I'm Binish aka Beans, your guide to the fascinating history, culture, and the science of plants. Together, we'll uncover how plants have shaped civilizations, ecosystems, and our understanding of the natural world. Let's kick off with our next episode. To understand the Victorian Garden Cemetery, we first have to understand the problem it solved. For centuries, people in Britain were buried in small, cramped churchyards right in the heart of their towns. By the early 1800s, these spaces were catastrophically crowded. Graves were stacked, the air was foul, and the contaminated water from these sites spread cholera and typhoid. The old churchyard was no longer just a place of rest. It had become a source of death itself. The solution emerged from two powerful forces: urgent public health reform and the romantic landscape tastes of the era. The idea was to move the burial away from populated centers and into a completely new kind of space. The blueprint came from the private estates of the wealthy, who had long built symbolic monuments in their gardens, using weeping willows, yew trees to signify sorrow and eternity. The Victorians took this private language of the mourning garden and democratized it on a massive public scale. The result was the Garden Cemetery. The first of its kind in Britain was the Glasgow necropolis in 1833. This was a pivotal moment. It was a commercial cemetery laid out like a beautiful hilly park designed for all classes to purchase a dignified burial plot. This model was a runaway success. It was quickly followed by the Magnificent Seven, which was 7 large new garden cemeteries circling London, starting with Kensal Green in 1833 and Highgate in 1839. Towns across the country like Wrexham in 1876 soon followed suit, creating their own versions. These weren't just graveyards, they were designed landscapes where every tree, every flower, and every winding path was a word in a silent universal language of loss and hope. A language we have largely forgotten, but one we can still learn to see. The first things you'd notice in these garden cemeteries were the trees. They stood like quiet guardians, each with a powerful meaning. The most famous was the weeping willow. Its long drooping branches looked like fallen tears, making it the perfect symbol for sadness and mourning. This tree was so linked to grief that people often carved its image directly onto the tombstones. Then there was the cypress tree. Its tall, dark, slender shape brought a feeling of solemn respect. It was a symbol of mourning and eternal life, often planted in lines along the main paths. The yew tree held two meanings, death and everlasting life. It is famous for living an incredibly long time, sometimes over 1,000 years. Because it stayed green all year, it became a powerful symbol that life continues even after death. Together, these trees turned the cemetery into more than just a resting place. They created a quiet language of grief, memory, and hope. As you walked through the cemetery, you'd come across the flowers, and this is where a quiet code began to unfold. Victorians loved the language of flowers, where every flower carried its own message. Roses were the most common. They stood for love and remembrance, and their colors added another layer of meaning. Red roses showed deep love and grief. Pink roses spoke of gentleness. White roses meant purity and were often placed for children. Lilies, especially white ones, symbolized purity, innocence, and the hope of being reborn after death. Smaller flowers carried more personal messages. The forget-me-not was a simple plea, "Do not forget me." Violets and pansies stood for faithfulness and tender memory. These flowers created soft reminders of the lives once lived, turning each grave into a small story waiting to be read. Alongside the flowers were the evergreens, plants that stayed green all year. Ivy was one of the most meaningful. Because it clings and holds on as it grows, it came to represent faithful attachment and eternal life. You'd often see it winding up monuments or gently covering graves. Rosemary carried its own message too. The old phrase, "Rosemary for remembrance," made it a natural part of these gardens, and people would sometimes carry a sprig of it during funerals. Other evergreens like holly and box were chosen for their steady presence. Holly, with its sharp leaves and bright red berries, stood for endurance. Box, with its neat compact shape, formed calm tidy borders around family plots, giving the space a feeling of quiet order. In their presence, the cemetery felt quietly cared for, as if the plants held on to memory even when people could not. It wasn't just the plants that spoke. The shapes carved into the stone and the wreaths placed around the graves had their own stories to tell. The wreath, made from leaves like laurel and ivy, was an old symbol. The Greeks and the Romans gave them to their heroes, but here, in the quiet of a Victorian cemetery, the meaning had changed. A wreath now meant a victory over death itself, a subtle sign that a person had fought the good fight and had won their place in heaven. You would find these wreaths resting on the heads of stone angels, held tightly by figures frozen in grief, or hung simply on the side of a tomb. Flowers too were carved on graves, and each had their own silent language. A rose in full bloom often meant a married woman lay there, while a small closed rosebud might mark the grave of a child. Lilies were everywhere. In a practical way, their strong sweet smell helped cover the scent of decay, but they also stood for purity, for Christ and the Virgin Mary. There was also an unspoken belief that the earth itself could be a judge. People said that if a person had been good, flowers would naturally spring from their grave, but if they had been wicked, only weeds would take root. In this way, the cemetery became a place where the earth itself seemed to reveal the truth about who lay beneath. Naturally, the Victorians had to balance symbolism with practicality. While the meanings were important, cemetery planners had to think carefully about how plants would grow. They avoided planting big trees with strong roots too close to graves so that they wouldn't damage the stones and vaults beneath. They preferred slow-growing plants like yew and box because, once established, they required minimal care and would keep the gardens beautiful for generations with less ongoing work. These garden cemeteries became so popular as peaceful retreats that they actually inspired the very first public parks in America. However, these symbolic landscapes faced very real challenges. They encountered problems like vandalism, neglect, and later improvement campaigns that sometimes ripped out the original plantings. This is why not all historic species survive today in their original locations. So, the next time you walk through an old cemetery, take a closer look. See the weeping willow as a symbol of timeless sorrow. See the rose as a message of enduring love. See the ivy as a promise that someone will be remembered. These Victorian garden cemeteries were special places, a living, growing language of loss and love. They were designed not just to honor the dead, but to comfort the living, to help us express what words alone cannot, and to promise that those who were gone would never be forgotten. Thank you for tuning into Roots Revealed. Support the show by leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform and sharing episodes with friends and family. If you have any feedback or suggestions, reach out to me at hello@rootsrevealed.org. Remember to keep exploring your roots and celebrating the rich diversity of our shared history. See you next time. Bye.